This conference will now be recorded.
Okay. Yesterday we were discussing about what is namespace, what is pod, all those stuff. Yesterday we created a pod. We created a pod in our Kubernetes cluster. So I have my Kubernetes cluster up and running. Yesterday we created a namespace. This namespace. I created a pod. In which namespace I created a pod? Yesterday I created a pod in this namespace testNS. By default, as I told, by default, kubectl is pointing to which namespace? The context, Kubernetes context, kubectl context. Kubectl is pointing to which context? Kubectl is pointing to the default namespace. Now, if I want to see, I can use this option. I can use this option, -n testNS. -n testNS. Now, I don't want to use always this -n. Anyhow, I am always going to work on this namespace. Is it possible for me to change the context instead of default namespace? My kubectl should point to this namespace. My kubectl should point to that namespace. Stop webcam sharing, guys. Bala KT from Hyderabad. Stop the webcam. I can stop. Okay. So he is roaming on the roads. He is going somewhere else and he is attending the classes. He is showing us the Hyderabad city, how climate is in Hyderabad. It's very sunny. Okay, let me stop. Okay. I stop the screen share. Okay. So what I was saying here, is it possible for me to change the context? I mean to say, I don't want to use always this -n, this. I want my kubectl to point to that namespace. Is it possible? Yes. So we can use this command, kubectl config. Config. You use this help command if you don't know. So we can display the current context.
నానే ఈ ఫోన్ అంటే బేటా
Guys, please be on mute. Okay. So kubectl config.
ఓరే అమ్మ ఒక ఫోన్ ఇయ్యాను రానే
Guys, please be on mute. Bala, I think he's joined over mobile for some reason today. I think he's not on mute. He's switched on webcam. Please be on mute. So we can use this config, these commands to set the context, to change the context. Now, kubectl config this current context. So it is pointing to this Kubernetes cluster default namespace. Now I can set the context to different, I mean to say namespace. So something like this, kubectl config set context. I can set the context hyphen namespace equals to something like this. In the current hyphen current, I mean to say this is my current Kubernetes cluster. In the current Kubernetes cluster, use the current cluster only.
ఎక్కడికి వస్తున్నావు?
Use the current cluster only. Then set the names, context to this namespace. So current cluster, this Kubernetes cluster, I'm just changing the context. I mean to say namespace. Something like this, hyphen namespace. There is a typo. Now I have changed the context. Current Kubernetes cluster, I pointed to this namespace. Now when I execute any kubectl commands, now is it pointing to which context? Am I using hyphen n? Am I using hyphen n now after changing the context? Now my kubectl is pointing to which namespace? After executing this command, my kubectl is pointing to which namespace? Here, the option I use this current Kubernetes cluster. Only one Kubernetes cluster is there as of now in my kube config. As of now, I have only one Kubernetes cluster in my kube config. In the current Kubernetes cluster, I'm changing the context to this namespace. So which means now my kubectl is pointing to which namespace? So this is the context, current cluster. Then within that cluster, it is pointing to the test namespace. Now, if I want to point to different namespace, can I change the context again? Now I don't want to point to this namespace. Can I again change it to default? Now, this time it is pointing to which namespace now? This time it is pointing to which namespace now? Again, I change the context, default. Now, we can change the context, right? When you are working with multiple Kubernetes clusters, when you are working with multiple Kubernetes clusters and namespaces, can I change the context of my kubectl to which cluster it has to point, to which namespace it has to point? We can do that by changing the context. Now, I change my context again. Now, if I want to see pods in that namespace, can I use this option now explicitly? I need to mention this one. If I want to see in all the namespaces, can I use this option? Hyphen A. Yes. Now, we created a pod. We created a pod in this namespace. Now, pod has an IP address also. How can I see more details about this pod? Additional details apart from name, status, age. I want to see some additional options. I can use -o wide. So what is this IP? Pod IP. What is this IP? It's not container IP. It's a node IP. Node, in which node this pod is scheduled. So I can, the way you have a inspect in Docker, if I want to see more details about Kubernetes resources like pod, node, anything, there is a command called describe here. there is a command called describe. kubectl describe what I want to describe. I want to describe my pod. This is my pod name. Now why I am getting this error? Pod, this is not found, even though there is a pod. When I am trying to describe like this, why I am getting this pod not found? Now it is looking this pod in which namespace? Now default. So my pod is not in that namespace. I'm trying to say something like this. Now I can describe what is the pod name, in which namespace it is created, in which ID it is created, if you have any labels, the pod IP. So as of now, that pod has how many containers? That pod has how many containers as of now? Under container section, you can see only one. Now you can describe the pod. You can describe the pod, right? Now let's say I want to access the application which is running in this pod container. How can I access? Within the cluster, how can I access? Outside the cluster, how can I access? Now within this pod there is one container. My application is running in that. How can I access? Will I able to access? Now my question is, understand my question. Now I deployed one container, I mean to say one pod. Now this is my Kubernetes cluster. Now I created one pod. I created one pod. Inside that pod, I have this container where my application is running. Now I want to access this application. I want to access this application. I want to access this application now. How can I access? This is my Kubernetes cluster. This is my cluster. As part of my cluster, let's say as part of my cluster, I have total 3 nodes. This is my cluster now. So in my cluster, as of now, there are 3 nodes. I deployed one pod. I created one pod. I deployed one application. Now my application is running now here. So that pod has an IP address. This is the pod IP. That pod is running in this node. So this is the node IP address, private IP address. This is the private IP address of that node. Now, how can I access? Within the cluster or outside the cluster, right? So within the cluster, what is meaning of within the cluster? Anywhere, from this machine, this machine, this machine. That is the meaning of within the cluster. Any application, any process within this cluster. Cluster in the sense either master or workers. Suppose I have one more machine. I have a lot of other machines. In the same VPC, in the same network, I have a lot of other machines also. This machine is also part of same VPC, same network. but is it part of my cluster? So I have one more machine here. One more machine here. Can I consider that as within the cluster? No. So within the cluster in the sense, anywhere, any application, any process which is running in the same Kubernetes cluster, that can be in a master nodes or worker nodes. Now within the cluster, how can I access? And outside the cluster, how can I access? Now each and every pod has an IP. Using that pod IP, now I am in which node? I am in which node? This 88. This 88 is what? Which node? The master node. So within the cluster, can I use that pod IPs? I mean to say, will pod IPs will work? Now this is my pod IP. I am trying to curl this is what? This is what? That is what? Pod IP. What is this? 88 is what? The port, the container port which is running in that pod. The container port which is running in that pod. Then my application context. Then my application context. Is it working? Am I getting the response from that application, from that container? Since there is no browser in this machine, this is a Linux machine. Since there is no browser, I am just testing using curl. Am I getting the response from that pod, that container? Am I getting the response from that pod, that container? Am I getting that response, 200 response, this response from that pod, that container? Yes. But can I use this from outside the cluster? Outside the cluster in the sense from any other system? From outside the cluster, am I able to access from my system, my laptop? Is it working here using pod IP? This is very, very important. Communication. No. Now let's say from this one, maybe I have a one worker. These two are workers. There will it work since they are part of the cluster? If I go to that machine, let's go to that machine. I am logging into that worker machines. So this is also part of my cluster. This is also part of my cluster. This 93 node is also part of my cluster. Now here, will it work? Will it work using pod IP? Will I able to access? Is it working from this machine? Since it is part of the cluster, is it working? Yes. Now let's say I have this machine. Let's say I have this machine. This machine. Here I just installed kubectl. I have just a kubectl here. I have a kube config file. I can talk to the Kubernetes. But is it part of the cluster? This machine? Let me connect to this machine. I will be able to communicate with cluster. I mean to say API server. So here, if you remember last session, I installed kubectl. I have a kube config file. I am able to communicate with API server. But is this machine, the current machine, is it part of the cluster? No. Here, Will I able to access using that pod IPs from there? Will I able to access using pod IPs? Is it going to work from this machine? No. So within the cluster, pod IPs will work. But again, within the cluster also, if one application has to communicate with other application, is it recommended to use pod IPs in the code, or is it recommended to depend on the pod IPs? Within the cluster also, let's say one microservice want to communicate with other microservice. Let's say I have one more application. So this is one more application, different application. This is different application. This is another application. Let's say one application. Within that, some microservice, some container is running. Now this application want to communicate with this application which is running in another pod. Pod IP will work. Pod IPs will work from here to here. They can communicate using pod IP, but is it recommended? So from this pod, it can make a API call to this application on that IP, on that port, on whatever context, that API context. Is it recommended to use these IPs for one application to communicate with other application within the cluster also? No. Why? Why it is not recommended? Chandan is saying we should use local host and port. Does local host work between the pods? This is pod, this is another pod. The pods in the containers in two different pods, will they able to communicate using local host? This is one container in one pod. This is one container in another pod. Two different pods. Does local host work between the containers which are running in two different pods? No. Local host works where? Local host works if there are two containers which are running in a same pod. Suppose I have one more container which is running in this pod only. Then if this guy want to communicate with this guy, this application want to communicate with this application, this container want to communicate with this container which is running in a same pod, then does the local host and port works in this scenario? Yes. Now I have two different pods, this pod and this pod. One application in this pod container want to communicate with this one. We can use pod IPs, but it is not recommended to use pod IPs. Why? Why it is not recommended to use? Because pod IPs are dynamic. If the pod is deleted and recreated, do you have a guarantee that same IP will be assigned for that pod? So do you have a guarantee that same IP will be assigned to this pod? No. One is pod IPs are dynamic. We cannot depend on pod IPs. What is the one more reason, and very, very important reason, is in real time, suppose I have a multiple replicas in the sense multiple pods for that application, multiple pods for that application. Now if I use IPs, pod IPs directly, does load balance happens? Does load balancing will happen? Suppose this is one application, this application want to communicate with this application, there are two pods, there are two replicas. If I use pod IPs within the cluster, does load balancing can be achieved? Do we have any kind of a load balancing if we directly use pod IPs? Understand what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say here, I have two replicas, two pods for the same application. So this guy want to communicate with this application, but there are two pods, two replicas. Does load balancing happens if we use directly pod IPs? This will always communicate with whatever IP we are using. So that is where in Kubernetes there is a concept called service. We need to create a service. We need to create a service. In Kubernetes there is one more object, one more resource called as service. There is a one more concept, one more object called as service. What is service? So there are different types of services again. We have a cluster IP service, we have a node port service, we have a load balancer service. We will slowly understand one after the other. We will slowly understand one after the other. This is external load balancer. Basically a cloud load balancer. Like ELB. Okay. So we have a different types of services. We have a cluster IP service, we have a node port service, we have a load balancer service like this. Now, what is service? Why do we need service? Right? So service makes pods accessible or discoverable. Service makes pods accessible or discoverable. Pods, service makes pods accessible or discoverable within the cluster, or we can expose them to the internet. Internet in the sense outside. Service makes pods accessible or discoverable within the cluster, or we can expose them to the internet, which means outside the cluster. So we can create a service. Using that service, we can access the pods. We can create a service. Using that service, we can access the pods. So let me show the document, how it looks. The way you have a pods, we have a services also. So service is responsible for making our pods discoverable or accessible inside the network, inside the cluster, or exposing them to the internet outside the cluster. So we have a different types of services. We have a cluster IP service, we have a node port service, we have a load balancer service. We will understand slowly one after the other. So we can create a service of type cluster IP. So I have a pods, right? I have a pods. Now I have this pod, something like this. Now I can create a service for my application, my pods. I can create a service. There are different types of services. We have a cluster IP service, we have a node port service, load balancer service. First, let me explain cluster IP service. If I create a service of type cluster IP, that will expose the application, I mean to say that will expose the pods, that will expose the service on a cluster internal IP. So service is reachable within the cluster. Service is reachable within the cluster. If I create a service of type cluster IP, we can access using that service within the cluster. So I can create a service of type cluster IP. So when I create a service of type cluster IP, what happens in the background? I am going to get one virtual IP address. When I create a service of type cluster IP, I am going to get one virtual IP address that we call it as a cluster IP, service IP. Cluster IP, service IP. We are going to get one virtual IP address, service IP address. So I can talk to this service, this application can talk to this service. This application can talk to this service using that service name or cluster IP. What this service does? What this service does? That service will route the traffic to the respective. That service will route the traffic to the respective pods. That service will route the traffic to the respective pods. Now, instead of talking to the pods directly within the cluster, can I talk to the service so that service will route the traffic to the pods irrespective where it is running and how many replicas it is running? Suppose let's say this service has more than one replica. Does this service act as a load balancer within the cluster? Internal load balancing within the cluster. Suppose this service has multiple replicas, multiple pods. Does this service does the load balancing when this is accessing via service? Are you understanding what I am trying to say? Are you clear? Very, very important concepts. What is the problem with pod IPs? Why we should not use pod IPs? Why we need to create a service? Why we need to create a service? Pods are dynamic. Pods are dynamic. Pod IPs will keep on changing. And if I have a multiple replicas of same application, same pod, do I need a kind of a load balancing also within the cluster? If I use pod IPs directly, there won't be any load balancing. So we are going to create a services, Kubernetes services. Service is responsible for accessing, I mean to say service is responsible for accessing the pods within the cluster or exposing it to the internet. Now, this pod want to communicate with this application. We can create a service for this application, then we can use that service name. We have a service of type cluster IP, this one. So when we create a service, what will happen in the background? When we create a service, we are going to get one virtual IP address. One virtual IP address. We call it as a service IP or cluster IP. So it will be registered in the DNS. It will be registered in the DNS with that name, that service name. Suppose I am creating a service name with this. Does this IP will be registered with this name? Kind of a mapping, DNS mapping within the Kubernetes. Do we have a DNS within Kubernetes? Do we have a DNS within the cluster? Core DNS. We have a core DNS. So when I create a service, what will happen? I am going to get one IP address that we call it as a virtual IP address, service IP address. That IP will be registered to the DNS with this name. Now let's say I have one more application. This application want to talk to this one. This application want to talk to this one. Can I use that service name now within the cluster? So request goes to service. Can I use this name, service name? Can I use that service name? Request goes to that service. That service, what that service does that service route the traffic to the pods, the respective endpoints, respective pods. If there are more than one pod for that application, for that service, does this service act as a load balancer? Suppose this service has, let's say, 3 pods. This one, this one, this one. Now, if some other application, other pod is accessing this service, does the load balancing between these pods, whatever belongs to that service? Clear? It does the load balancing within the cluster. Now, when we create a service, we are going to get one IP address, virtual IP address. It will be registered in the DNS. Other application can use that service name for communication. If that service has multiple endpoints, that service will act as a load balancer within the cluster. Actually, service is just a logical concept. This service is just a logical concept, but the real work, actual work will be done by whom in the background? We are creating a service that is just a logical concept. In the background, the real work is done by whom? We discussed in the architecture. The real work will be done by whom? Kube proxy. Kube proxy. So that kube proxy will take care of the redirection. If someone is accessing service, that kube proxy will take care of the redirection from service to the pods. Suppose that service has multiple pods. Does the load balancing between those pods? Will it does the load balancing between those pods? Does the service act as a load balancer within the cluster? Does this service act as a load balancer and also DNS? Kind of, we can use this as a DNS name. We can use DNS name, and it will does the load balancing, service discovery. Now, how service will identify the pods? How service will identify the pods? Now I have a lot of pods. I have lot of different pods are there. Let's say I deployed this one. This is where my application is running. Let's say this is my Java web app pod. Let's say this is my Java web app pod. Let's say this is also my Java web app pod. So this is also Java web app pod. This is also Java web app pod. Let's say this is different pod, Python application. Now I want to create a service. I want to create a service for these pods. How service will identify the pods? Service will identify the pods based on the labels and selectors. Service will identify the pods based on the labels and selectors. So pod will have a labels. Pod will have a labels. Pod will have a labels. Can I use those labels as a selector in my service to identify? I am creating a service for this application. Let's say I created a pod. Pod has this label. Let's say pod will have a labels. I can have a labels for my pod. Something like this. Just to give an example, this is my labels for this pod. Labels for my pod. So this is my labels, let's say. something like this. I have a label. Now I am trying to create a service for this. Now while creating a service for this application, can I use these labels as a selector here? So I can use selector, something like this, app, Java web app. Now I created a service like this. Now does this service will consider this pod as part of this? I'm creating a service like this. Does this service will be considered this pod as part of this service? If this pod has a different label, if this pod has a different label, does this service will be considered this pod also to route the traffic? Does this service will route the traffic to this pod? No, right? So service will identify the pods based on the labels and selectors. Now again, if you see, I created a pod using imperative way. I created a pod using imperative way, not declarative way. Now I have a pod. I have a pod in this namespace. I have created in a imperative way. What command I used? I just used something like this. Something like this. Something like this I have given. Did I give any labels? Did I give any labels for this? No. But if you see, the labels has been added. Some label has been added. If you want to see the labels of pods, you can use this option, show labels. So what is the label Kubernetes has added, even though I have not mentioned label option? What is the key, label key? What is the label value? What is the label key? Label key is run. Label value is what? This one. Now, if I create a service by using these labels as a selector, the service will identify this pod. The service will route the traffic to this pod. Yes. So did I created a service as of now? Did I created a service? Do I have any service? This service is for Kubernetes, not for this application. Did I created a service for this application or this pod? Basically, no. Now let me create a service. Again, service can be created. Can I create a service in imperative way? Can I create a service in declarative way? Whatever way I want to do, I can do that. So if it is a declarative way, I will write in the form of YML, something like this. So I will write in the form of manifest file, API version, kind, metadata, spec, something like this. Now what kind of Kubernetes object I want to create? Now if I want to create a service, what will be the kind? Kind will be what kind of object? Kind will be service. Kind will be service. What is the API version for that service? V1. Metadata. Metadata will have a name. So whatever name here I am going to give, that name will be for what? Whatever name I am going to give here, that name will be for what? The name for the service. I can give some name, something like this, Java web app SVC, something like this. Now the specification, the service specification, type, what type of service? Now I want to access only within the cluster. What type of service I can create so that I can access only within the cluster? I am not going to expose this to outside the cluster. What type of service needs to be created? cluster IP. Now, how service will identify the pods? How service will identify the pods? I have a different pods. As I told, while creating a service, do I need to define the pod labels as a selectors? As a selector? Pod will identify the labels. Service will identify the labels. Service will identify the pods. If you see, service will identify the pods by its labels and selector. Now, pod has a labels. Pod has a labels. Can I use these labels as a selector while creating a service? So what is the option here? I can say selector. Selector. Now, what is the label my pod has as of now? What is the label my pod has as of now? Key is this. Key is this. Value is this. Now, can I mention something like this? Selector run, that is the key, value Java web app. Now, whatever pod has this label, or how many pods has this label, does the service will consider that as a endpoints to route? Suppose I have 2 pods with this label. Does this service will consider those 2 pods as endpoints to route the traffic? Suppose if I have 5 pods with this label, does this service will route the traffic to all those pods? Will it be considered as endpoints for those pods? Load balancing, right? Has the same label. Now I have defined the selector. Now port mapping, ports. I have a port, I have a target port. So this target port is nothing but what? This target port is nothing but what? What port I have to define? And which port your pod is running, your container is running. If request goes to service, this service has to route the traffic to your pods. On which port? The target port. What is my target port in this case? For this application, on which port my container is running? Here in this pod, on which port my container is running? 8080. So what is my target port? While creating a service, we are going to define the port mappings also. What is my target port now? In this case, 8080. Now this port is what basically? This is basically a service port. Service port. Suppose I am mapping service port as 80. Suppose since I mapped service port as 80, this application want to talk to this service. Since I created a service on service port 80, do I need to mention that port for accessing? Does this needs to use that port, service port? Since I mapped with 80, 80 is default. 80 is default, even though I don't mention. Request goes to this service on which port? If I just use service name, request goes to this service on which port? The default 80. So from this application, if I use the service name, just service name, I am not using any port, request goes to port 80. So if I created a service on port 80, is it going to accept that traffic? If someone is using this name, other application, they are not using any port. Since I created a service on port 80, does this service will accept the request on this port? This service? Yes. Then what that service does? Does that service route the traffic to the respective ports on target port? Will it route the traffic to respective ports on the target port? Yes. So suppose instead of 80, The service port also I have given as 8080. In that case, if this application is just using service name for communication, is it going to work? Suppose I created a service also on port 8080. If I just use this service name, will it work? Service is created on 8080 port. In that case, along with service name, do we need to use port also? Whatever service port you have created, like this. Same concept, guys, whatever we already discussed in the load balancer, right? Request goes to load balancer will route the traffic to your servers, general. So this Kubernetes service is also like what? This Kubernetes services is like, is like also kind of a load balancer only within Kubernetes. Now, this application will use this name, request goes to service route the traffic to your pods. Now, if the service is created on port 80, does this application needs to use that port? Without mentioning port also, it will work. Something like this. Now, imperative, declaratively, I can create a service like this. Declaratively. Suppose if it is imperative, this is declarative way. This is declarative. But in real time, whatever we create, whether it's a pod, a deployment, service, in real time, what approach we will follow? Are we going to create using imperative? Whether it's a pod, service, deployment, whatever you create in Kubernetes. Which model you will follow? Are you going to follow imperative or declarative? Declarative only. For practicing, you don't have that much time to type or create this much XML. I just want to practice very quickly. Then you can go for a imperative. Right? Now, imperative way, we can use one command called kubectl expose. Kubectl expose pod. What you want to expose? Pod. That pod name. And you can mention the port, hyphen port, hyphen target port, something like this. So I will expose. So if I execute this command, internally what it is going to create? Imperatively, I am going to execute this expose pod. So what this expose is going to do internally, what it is going to create? It is going to create a service. It is going to create a service. Something like this. Something like this. So something like this. Where is my notes? Something like this. Expose pod. What is my pod? What is my pod name? This pod name. Port. What type of service? I want to create cluster IP service. I want to create a cluster IP service. Now, the target port, hyphen target port. So what is my target port in this case? This is this one, service port. This is target port. What type of service you want to expose? Cluster IP. So I am exposing the pod, something like this. In which namespace I want to create this one again? In which namespace my pod is running? Do I need to create a service also in the respective namespace? In which namespace my pod is running as of now? Test namespace. My pod is running in a test namespace, not in the default namespace. I don't have a pod here. I have a pod in this namespace. Now I can use this option also. I can use this option also here, something like this -n. But if it is a YML declarative, I can mention something like this namespace, that namespace name. Now I am creating a service with this name. In which namespace this service will be created because of this option? This way. So what this is doing? Arvind is asking, can we define a service name also in imperative? So something like this. You can use name or it will be used this name. Let me expose this one using imperative way. Now as of now, do I have any service for that application in this namespace? Do I have any service? SVC. SVC stands for service. Our full form is service. Do I have any service in this namespace as of now? I have only pod, nothing else. Now let me expose this. Target port. Let's use P small. One second, guys. We will never use that imperative. I will give you one website. You can use that website here. kubectl commands. This commands. Now there is a expose. Where is that? Expose. So imperatively, if you want to do, you can use this. So what is the correct option for target port? It is something like this: -target port, target port, something like this. -target port. You can refer this website for imperative commands. Create whatever you want to create. Run kubectl run, which we used, right? So expose all these things. So you can use this website for imperative, but in real time we are not going to use imperative, only declarative. Now here I have exposed my service. Now this service got created. Do I have a service now? Do I have a service now? Here in this namespace, the way I have a pod, do I have a service also created? So what is this IP? Is it going to be my pod IP? Is this my pod IP? Whatever you see here. No. This is basically your service IP, virtual IP, service IP. Now, this service has how many endpoints? How many endpoints? If I want to see more details about this service also, can I use this command kubectl describe? I want to describe my service. I want to describe the service. This is my service name in this namespace. Now, if you see the endpoints here, I am describing my service. Service has a endpoints. What is this IP and what is this port? This is my service IP. Service has a endpoints. Service has a endpoints. I will create in a declarative also, guys. I'm trying to make you understand what is service. Going forward, I am going to use only declarative. I am going to create pods, services, everything is declarative. So what is this endpoint? Service has a endpoints. Service has a IP address. service has a endpoints. What is this endpoint? What is this and what is this? You can see the endpoints also by executing like this EP. EP stands for endpoints. Now I have one service, this service. That's if you want to just see the endpoints of a service, you can use something like this. EP. EP stands for endpoints. You can use something like this. So if you want to see just a service and its endpoints, you can do like this. But if I want to see more details about that service, I can describe a service like this. Now service has one endpoint. What is this IP? What is this port? Basically, this is your pod IP. And what is this port? The target port. Now, if I just use this service IP within the cluster, just service IP, service is created on which port? What is the service port? This 80 here, whatever it is showing here. What is this? That is service port. So if I am just using something like this, is it going to work? Am I going to get the response from that pod? I'm using service, the service IP. I have not mentioned the port because service is created on which port? Default. So Arvind is saying we have not defined a labels and selector while creating a service. So I use this command kubectl expose pod, the pod name. Now if you see, I am using imperatively, I said expose pod. I have explicitly mentioned expose this pod. For this pod, service got created. Do you see selector? Whatever that pod has a label, do you see that is already taken internally as a selector? So service is identifying the pods using labels. Now I am using service IP. Am I getting the response? I am using service IP. Now request is going to service on which port? Request is going to this service on which port? On which port request is going to the service? 80. Then does that service is routing the traffic to the endpoints? I mean to say the actual pods which belongs to that service? Yes. Now I have just only one pod. Suppose I create a one more pod with same labels. Does this service will have two endpoints? Suppose if I have a one more pod with same labels, does that service will have a two endpoints? In that case, if this service will it act as a load balancer? Yes. Now, do I really need to use this service IP also? I mean to say, if one application has to talk to other application using service, do they really need to depend on IP, or can they use their name, service name? Because there is a DNS, the IP is registered with this name, right? They no need to use IP, they can use name. So what is the name? What is the name of the service now? This one, service name. But the service name to IP resolution will happen within the pods, not from the nodes. Suppose I'm using like this from the node directly. Is it able to resolve? This name is able to resolve to the IPs when I'm directly accessing using from the nodes I'm accessing, not from the pods. Is this name is resolved to the IP from the node? Is this name is resolved to the IP, cluster IP, that service IP from the node? No. But if I use this name within the pod, suppose let me create a one more pod. Now let me show it in a declarative way. Let me show it in a declarative way. I am trying to deploy this application. I'm trying to deploy this application, Python application, let's say. I have an image. Let me show declarative way. I have this image. Now in Kubernetes, I want to deploy this application, this image. What needs to be created in Kubernetes? Can I directly create a container? Or do I need to create a pod? I have to create a pod for this image. For this image, I want to create a pod. Now, let me show it in a declarative way, YML. So we have these attributes, API version, kind, metadata, spec. Spec stands for specification. Now, what kind of object you want to create? Now, I want to create what? For now, I want to create a pod. P caps, O small, pod. What is the API version for the pod? V1. Metadata, name. Name. Whatever name I am going to give here, that will be what? Whatever name I am going to give here, that will be the name of the pod. Now, namespace. In which namespace I want to create? In which namespace I want to create? Let's say this also I want to create in some namespace. I can give that namespace name. Now, spec. What is this? This specification is for what? The spec stands for specification. That specification stands for what? Pod specification. So pod will have what? Pod will have what? Pod has a containers and values. Containers and values. Now, containers. Containers, right? Name. Container name. Image. From which image? Ports. Your container port, something like this. For now, I am not using any values. Suppose if I want to mount some values to that pod, where can I define that volume information? Suppose I want to mount some values to my pod, those values I want to use in these containers, then I can use this option, values option. This we will discuss later. As of now, we don't have any values. We are not mapping any values because there is no use case. Now, if I want to create a multiple containers in a same pod, can I repeat this section? Can I repeat this section? Suppose I want to have a multi containers. Can I repeat this section like this? The name of the container, from which image you want to create, what is the container port, lot of other attributes also there. Lot of other attributes also there. We will slowly understand. Now, can I create a pod like this using manifest? Most importantly, the labels. 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 Key, value. So these labels are for what? Whatever labels I can give here. I can have a multiple labels also. These labels will be attached to what? This metadata is for this object. So these labels will be attached to what? This will be attached to the pod. This will be attached to the pod. Now, I want to create a pod for this application. Can I write something like this? API version, kind, metadata, spec, API version, V1, kind, pod, metadata, name. You can give some name, Python app, something like this. Namespace. Suppose if I want to have this application also deployed in this namespace, that name. Labels. Labels are very, very important. Let's say I'm saying label as this one, label as Python app. Now, if you wrongly configure the labels, let's say I'm going to give something like this, label as Java web app. Now, the moment I deploy this pod, Python pod, does this service will be considered that pod also as its service, its endpoint? Suppose I wrongly create a pod. I already have this service. This service has a selector like with this label. Suppose if I deploy Python pod also, does this pod will be considered as endpoint for that service which is already running? Is that correct? Are you getting my point, what I am trying to say? Now, I am trying to deploy this one. Let's say if I add a label like this, if I add a labels like this, run Java web app. Now, does this is also considered as a endpoint for this service? Suppose if I create a pod, this Python pod like this, does this service will consider this also as one endpoint, this pod also? But is that correct? Suppose service routes the traffic to this one. Is it anything running on that 8080 in this pod? Is anything running on 8080? If service route the traffic to this pod, do you get a response? If this service route the traffic to this pod, do you get a response? No. So labels and selectors are very, very important. You need to properly define the labels and selectors, right? So is it correct? Can I define like this? No, right? Let me give something like this, whatever you want to give. Label. If required, can I give multiple labels like this? Anything, n number of labels, just key value pairs. Just key value pairs. You can give n number of labels. Then under spec containers. Name of the container, I can say Python app. Just something like this image. So using this image I want to create. And again guys, as I already told, if I don't mention the tag, is it going to work? Is it going to, what tag will be used by default? Colon latest. If I have that image, fine. If I have that image, fine. If I don't have that image, is Kubernetes will be able to pull and create a container? Now I don't have that image. So we will get one error. We will get error, image pull back off. Image pull back off. Sometimes in the interview they are going to ask this question also. What is image pull back off? Or error image pull? This error. You will get these errors. So in which scenario I will get this image pull back off or error image pull? That will be in two scenarios. Either the image doesn't exist in your registry or repository, or you have not authenticated. Suppose if it is a private repository, if you are not authenticated, then also you will get this error. Two scenarios. One is if your image doesn't exist in the repository. Other one is if it is a private repository, you are not authenticating. Then what type of error you will see when you try to deploy? Image pull back off or error image pull. Now, if I give something like this, it will be considered as colon latest. But do I really have that image in my registry? I'm using Docker Hub, Docker registry. No. So let me give something like this. Then ports, container port. On which port it is running? This is a Python application. On which port this container we exposed? 5000. So this is a pod I am creating. Suppose I want to access this application also. Suppose I want to access this application, then do I need to create a service for this application? I want to access this pod, whether internally or externally. Then do I need to create a service for this application? Yes. Do I need to create in a separate YML, or can I create a multiple Kubernetes in a single YML? Can I create multiple Kubernetes resources with the help of single YML, or do I need to have a separate YML for each and every resource? Whatever is convenient for you. I can have it in a single YML also. Now, if you see, I can separate this one using 3 dashes. I can separate using 3 dashes. Now, I can create a service like this. Service like this. For this application, service name, let's say I will say Python app, something like this. Cluster IP. But this is very, very important. Now I'm creating a service for this application. What should be my selectors here? What should be my selectors here now? Can I have these? Whatever labels I have attached to that pod, can I have those labels as a selector here? Then port mapping. So is my target port correct? Is my target port correct in this case? No. What should be my target port? 5000. Now, Babu is asking one question, sir, do we need to create a service in any node or only in the master? If you understand correctly, we are creating service. Service is like one Kubernetes resource. If I want to create any resource in Kubernetes, whom should I interact? Whom should I interact? I want to create a pod, or I want to create a service, or I want to create a deployment. With the help of whom I can create these Kubernetes resources? Master, right? So this is Kubernetes resource. This can be created with the help of master control plane. Suppose I have a Kubernetes client in this machine. I have a Kubernetes client in this machine, kubectl. Can I execute those kubectl commands from this machine, even though it's not a master, even though it's not a worker? Can I request to create those pods, services in the cluster from this machine? Yes. But will I able to access the applications, whatever is deployed in this cluster, using that service IPs or service names? No. But within the cluster, does one application can access other application using that service names? We can access. Clear, Babu? Don't get confused. Okay. Now I can create a service like this. Now this is my YML. In single YML, I can have something like this. As of now, I have only these things in this namespace. Now let me create this one. So we will use 3 dashes to separate. So this is one Kubernetes resource. This is one Kubernetes resource. So what Kubernetes resources I'm going to create with the help of this manifest file? With the help of this manifest file, what Kubernetes resources I'm trying to create? I'm trying to create a pod, and also I'm trying to create a service. In which namespace I'm creating my pod and my service? Test namespace. So my pod will have how many containers as per the specification? My pod will have how many containers as per the specification? One. Right? Let me apply kubectl apply -f. There is a indentation problem. Line number 12. Here, do you have some problem? Indentation here, here. So let me correct that. Now, did I got the output? Pod is created, service is created. Now, this application, now let's say this application want to talk to this application. Can they use this service name? This pod, this application, the application which is running in this pod want to communicate with this application, this pod. Can they use this service name within the cluster? It will work. Now, let's see if pods are running. Now I want to prove that. How can I go inside this pod container and see whether I can work, it will work or not? Will I able to go inside the pod the way I have went inside the container using Docker exec? Will I able to go inside the pods container shell in Kubernetes? Yes. What command we have to use? kubectl exec -it. What this -it stands for? Interactive. Which pod? This pod. Then what command? Bash. Now, why I am getting this error? This pod not found. Why I am getting this error? The pod not found. Why I am not able to go inside that pod container? Because of the namespace. Let me mention the namespace. Now I am inside which? I am inside what? I am inside this pod, inside that Python container. Now, this application want to access this application, this Java application. Can they use this service name? IP also work. I have a curl. IP also work. But instead of IP, can they directly use name, service name? Instead of service IP, can they use service name also? DNS. Now, Java web app. Do you see? Is one application, one pod want to communicate with other pod? Can they use that service name? Now this guy want to talk to my Java web application pod. Is it able to communicate using that service name, whatever we have created for that application? Yes. Suppose if that service has two pods, does this service does the load balancing between those replicas, those endpoints? Yes. Within the cluster, they can use service name. Now, is these two applications can communicate with each other? This application and this application, can they communicate with each other using service names instead of pod IP, instead of server IP, instead of this cluster IP? Can they use service name? DNS, service discovery? Yes. Now, I want to access from outside. Will I able to access outside of the cluster using this cluster IP service? using this IP address from outside? Can I use that IP outside the cluster? Then if I want to access from outside, what type of service can be created so that I can access from outside? The way you have a cluster IP service, there is a one more service called node port service. There is one more service called node port. So this node port is in the Docker. In the Docker, we have like this, right? -p. What is that -p in Docker? We are using -p in the Docker, right? Like port mapping, host port with container port. This node port is like similarly to the port publish. So what I can do, we can expose the service, the Kubernetes service on each node IP at a node port, static port. So I can create a node port service. So we are going to get one port on each and every node. We can access that application, that service using that port, node port. It is also a very important interview question. What is the node port range in Kubernetes? What is the node port range in Kubernetes? It is also an important question. What is the node port range? In which range the port will be allocated for that service, node port service? If you see, the node port range is this one, 30,000 to 32,767. Now, if you understand this diagram, it is like this. So when I create a service of type node port, this is my Kubernetes cluster. This is my Kubernetes cluster. If I create a service of type node port, on each and every node, we can access that service on some port. Now, from outside, can I use that IP, node IP? What is the meaning of node IP? Can I use any node? That can be master node, that can be worker node. Can I use that node IP, server IP? Using that node IP and a port which I got for that service, I can use that node IP and node port to access from the outside. Request goes to that node on that port. What that kubeproxy does? That kubeproxy route the traffic to the service, that cluster IP, then it will route the traffic to the pods. Now, how can I create? Can I create? Do I need to create another service of type node port, or can I change this itself instead of cluster IP? If I want to access from outside also, can I change this from cluster IP to node port? I can change this from cluster IP to node port also. You no need to create another. If you have created using imperative, you can edit something like this: kubectl edit. What you want to edit? Service. Which service you want to edit? This service I want to edit. This is in this namespace. Now here, instead of cluster IP, can I change it to node port? Now I no need to create another service. I can change from cluster IP to node port. Now the moment I change cluster IP to node port, now what type of service is this? What type of service is this? What type of service is this? Node port. Now within the cluster, still within the cluster, does this application, can access this application using this service name. Still you have a, within the cluster, there is a cluster IP that DNS will work as is. Does this application can still access this application using this service name, even though it's a node port type, you still use within the cluster. Now, if I want to access from outside the cluster, now since I created a node port service, what is this port? I got some port here. What is this port? 32326. Node port. Now from outside the cluster, can I use any node, which means master node, worker node? Can I use any node IP, that server IP, and this port to access this service from outside? If you see, let me show you. Netstat is not there. Netstat is not there. If you see now, do you see one port? This 23, what is this? 23236. Sorry, 32326. If you see 32326, is that port is listening in the server? This is master server, master node. Do you see that port is listening in the server 32326? So if any request goes to this server, this is master server. If any request goes to this server on this port, who is going to process that request? Service is a logical concept, as I told. In the background, real work is done by whom? Proxy. Similarly, in each and every node, in the worker node also, is that port is opened? Is that port is going to be listening in the worker node also? I am in the worker node. Now, one of the worker node, if I have a netstat, I don't have a netstat. Let me install netstat. So in each and every node, is that port is listening for that service? Now, do you see that port? That port, what is that port? 32326. Is it listening in this node also? Which means when I create a service of type node port, is one port is going to be listen in each and every node in the cluster. Now, can I use that port and can I use that node IP and that node port to access from outside the cluster? From outside the cluster, if I want to access, can I use this server IP and this node port from outside the cluster? Yes. But inside the cluster, they can still use this service name. If one application want to talk to other application, can they still use that service name? That service name, whatever name we created within the cluster. Yes. Now we created a node port service. Now let me open firewall, that AWS concept. That can be from any node. From this node also will I able to access that application using this machine IP and that port. From this machine, which is part of the cluster, I can access. From this machine also I can access. So open that firewall, that's AWS concept. What port needs to be opened, guys? That service port, that node port. On which port it is running? On which port the service is created? On which port this is created? 32326. 32326. Now I am opening in one of the node in the cluster. Now, using that node IP, using this node IP, public IP, using that port 32326 and my application context, am I able to access that application from outside the cluster using that node IP and node port? Now, this application also, let's say this Python application also I want to access from outside. Then if I want to access from outside, can I create a service of type node port instead of cluster IP? So this I have created using declaratively. Can I edit that YML? Can I edit this YML? In the YML, can I change this from cluster IP to node port? And can I apply? I need to apply that YML again. Now I changed from cluster IP to node port. I got one more port for this service. Now using this port, can I access this service, this application from outside using this port 30633. 30633 from outside. Now, first of all, do I need to open the firewall, this 30633 in AWS? AWS concept. AWS firewall is not open. That's why it is not working. So let me open that firewall. What is that port? 30633. 30633. Now I open that firewall. Now let's see. Am I getting that response from that Python application? I think there is some API also. These are the application context. Something is running on the root context. In Python application, this is working on the root context. Am I getting the response from Python application now from outside? So if I want to access the Kubernetes applications within the cluster or outside the cluster, what needs to be created, guys? Whether it is within a cluster or outside the cluster, what needs to be created? We need to create a service. Service will identify the pods. Service will identify the pods. Based on what? Service will identify the pods based on the labels and selectors. Now, let's say if something goes wrong with pod, does pod is going to be created? Now I will tell you the reason why we should not create a pods. Suppose something goes wrong with this pod. Let's say something goes wrong with this pod. I'm deleting the pod intentionally. Does pods will be automatically created? Now, let's say something went wrong with this pod. Does pod will be automatically created? No. Now, service is still there, but this time, does this service will have any endpoints? Does this service will have any endpoints? Service is still there, but this service will able to route the traffic to any pod because we don't have any pod with that label. Now, does that service has any endpoint? This service, why there is no endpoint for that service? Why there is no endpoint? Because if service is able to find any pod with that given selectors, with the given selectors, is it able to find any pod as of now? No. So pod is deleted. So is pod is getting created automatically? Is the pods are getting created automatically? If something goes wrong with your pod, Are you getting the pod automatically? Are you getting that pod automatically? No. So that's why, is it recommended to create a pods directly? Are we going to create a pods directly in Kubernetes? No. We are not going to create a pods directly in Kubernetes because pod is ephemeral. It won't be rescheduled. When any pod goes down or node goes down, pods will not be rescheduled, recreated automatically. So you should not create pods directly. You should not create or use pods directly. So to create the pods and manage the pods, we have some other resources like replica sets, deployments, daemon sets, replication controllers. So you should not create or use pods directly. To create a pods, you need to create the pods with the help of controllers like replica sets, deployments, daemon sets. So if I create a pods with the help of these controllers, if something goes wrong with that pod, who is going to replicate that pod again? Does these controllers, does these resources will take care of replicating if something goes wrong with that pod? Yes. So we should not create a pods directly. We have to use these resources like a replica set, replication controller, deployment, daemon sets to keep the pods alive. So is it recommended to create pods directly like this? Whether imperative, declarative, are you going to create a pods directly like this in real time? No. We will create a pods. We'll create a pods, but not directly. With the help of what? We will have something like this, replication controllers, or replica sets, daemon sets, deployments. So if I create a pods with the help of those will replicate your pods. Now, if I directly create a pods, will I able to scale up, scale down my pods? Will I able to increase and decrease my pod replicas if I directly create a pod? Will I able to increase and decrease the replicas of that pod if I directly create a pod? No. So in real time, you are not going to create a pods directly. We are going to use some controllers like this. So tomorrow, I will explain what is this replication controller, what is replica set, what is daemon set. Slowly you'll understand all these things, deployment. But in real time, you are not going to directly create a pod. But without explaining pod, what is pod, if I directly explain these things, you will not understand. Without explaining what is pod, if I directly go and create a deployment, or if I directly go and create these replication controllers, you will not understand. So that's why first I am explaining pod, then I am going for these controllers. Now Arvind is asking one question. Can we create both cluster IP service, node port service for any application? For internal and external communication, you can create, but do I really need two services? Do I need to create two services, one for internal, one for external? Can I use single service for both internal and external? Now, I created a service of type node port. Can't I use this service name for internal communication? Can't I use this one, this service name for internal communication? Do I really need to create two separate service, one for internal, one for external? Not required. Not required. Within the cluster, still we can use this one. So for external, you have to use node IP and node port. For internal, service names. For external, node IP and node port. What is the meaning of node IP? Will I able to access from outside using the service name, this cluster IP and this port? from outside, am I able to use this service IP and this node port? Is it going to work this way from outside? No, it is not going to work. This cluster IP, this service is for internal. For external, node IP and node port. Node IP and node port. What is the meaning of node? What is the meaning of node IP? Or what is the meaning of node? The server, the Kubernetes server, that can be a worker or that can be a master. Based on use case. Suppose I don't want to expose this application from outside. I don't want to expose this application to the outside world. I don't want anyone to access this application from outside the cluster. Only within the cluster, it should be accessible. Then what type of service I can create so that no one can access this one from outside? What type of Kubernetes service I can create so that no one can access from outside? Cluster IP. Okay. That is how it works. Clear? At least what is pod, what is service, what is namespace? We discussed so far only what is namespace, what is pod, what is service. Is everyone clear on this? So tomorrow I am going to explain what is this replication controller, replica set, daemon set, deployment. We'll slowly understand all these things. Thank you guys. Try to practice whatever has been discussed. Okay. Practice is most important. Whatever I am explaining is not whatever I am discussing also some kind of important, but at the end of the day, how much you are taking, how much you are practicing, what are the assignments you are doing, that is more important. Even though I explain for Kubernetes for 1 year, if you don't practice, there is no use. I already see people lost the interest. I am observing, but I don't want to say. Already I see only 45 to 50 people are attending the classes. Most of them are already not at all attending. But they need a job. They need a job with very good package. They want to become an expert. They want very good package, secure job, but they don't want to do the effort. That is not possible, guys. Right? That is not possible. You have to put an effort to learn something, to achieve something. Okay. So I don't want to repeat. It is up to them. So whoever is attending, I really appreciate. Kindly practice all those things and practice and do the assignments. Naresh is asking, am I responsible for integrating Kubernetes with Jenkins? Do we have a separate team? As a DevOps engineer, you are responsible for everything. As a DevOps engineer, you are responsible for setting up the Kubernetes clusters also. And also, you are responsible for implementing the CI/CD automation pipelines, which can build and deploy into the Kubernetes. As a DevOps engineer, we are responsible for both. But again, if there are a lot of team members, there are different teams. If there are a lot of team members, then the work will be shared. You will do some activity, lead or manager will assign some task to you. Maybe you are only looking after setting up the Kubernetes, administration of Kubernetes. Maybe another resource will take a role of writing the pipelines. But as a DevOps engineer, we are responsible for all these things overall. Okay guys, that's it from my side. Try to create pods, try to create a service, try to play around it. Tomorrow I'll continue with these concepts. Okay. Thank you.